I knew something was wrong the moment I turned onto my street. A cluster of neighbors stood in my driveway, pointing at my car, their faces twisted in frustration. My stomach dropped. The last time this many people gathered like that, it was because someone's fence had mysteriously collapsed overnight, right before they got slapped with an HOA fine. As I pulled up, I saw it. A thick, bright orange metal boot locked tight around the front wheel of my Tesla, like some kind of punishment marker. A hot pink notice flapped under the windshield wiper, its bold black letters screaming, "Parking violation. $350 fine. Boot removal fee, $150. Daily penalty, $50 until paid." I gritted my teeth. My driveway. My property. And yet, here I was, fined like some delinquent parking in a fire lane. "Judge Carter, they got your car too," Mrs. Myers called, wringing her hands. Her family ran the best barbecue joint in town, and she always brought me a rack of ribs when I helped her with paperwork for her small business. "This has to be a mistake," I said, yanking the notice from my windshield. I had been a judge for 15 years, but nothing boiled my blood like injustice right at my own doorstep. "Barbara Wilson was here with 2 men about an hour ago," Mr. Henderson muttered, leaning on his cane. "She had some kind of official-looking paper. Said your car wasn't supposed to be parked there because your driveway extension wasn't approved." I glanced down at the section of concrete I'd added last month, a perfectly legal extension. I had filed all the proper paperwork, paid for permits, and had the inspections done twice. Everything had checked out. "She's targeting everyone lately," Mrs. Martinez whispered, casting a wary glance across the street. "Last week she fined us $200 because my son's basketball hoop was too tall." I followed her gaze. 2 stories up, behind the pristine white blinds of a colonial-style home, Barbara Wilson was watching us. She stood there, phone in hand, snapping pictures like a private investigator gathering evidence. When our eyes met, she smirked, and then, just as quickly, the blinds snapped shut. I clenched the notice in my fist. Barbara thought she was untouchable. She had no idea who she was dealing with. I took a deep breath, forcing down the simmering anger rising in my chest. Losing my temper wouldn't help, not yet. If there was one thing I'd learned from the courtroom, it was that the best way to take down a corrupt figure wasn't with rage, but with evidence. And right now, I needed to start gathering some. "Mrs. Martinez, you still have that fine notice for the basketball hoop?" I asked, keeping my voice even. She nodded quickly. "And the one from last month, when she said our holiday wreath was excessively large?" "Mr. Henderson, what about your case?" The old man sighed, shifting his weight on his cane. "She fined me $175 for my accessibility ramp last spring. Said it wasn't in line with the neighborhood aesthetic. I had to fight her for weeks before she finally let me keep it, after I paid a reduced fine, of course." A sick feeling settled in my gut. This wasn't just pettiness. This was a pattern. A targeted system meant to drain people of money and bully them into submission. I turned my eyes back to Barbara's house. She wasn't just enforcing rules, she was making them up as she went. That night, after most of the neighbors had gone home, Frank Wilson made his move. I heard the knock at my door just after 10 p.m., 3 quick raps, followed by a hesitation, then one more. When I opened it, Barbara's husband stood on my porch, shifting nervously from foot to foot, glancing over his shoulder as if expecting someone to drag him back across the street. "Judge Carter," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "I need to talk." I stepped aside, and Frank hurried in, wringing his hands. Up close, he looked exhausted, a man crushed under the weight of secrets. "I can't stop her," he said, voice shaking. "I've tried. I've begged. But Barbara, she won't listen. It's like she enjoys this." He ran a hand over his face, exhaling sharply. But tonight, when I saw your car, I knew it had gone too far. I motioned for him to sit. How long has this been happening? Frank hesitated, rubbing at his temple. It started small. A fine here, a warning there. But then she figured out how easy it was to scare people into paying whatever she demanded. He reached into his coat pocket, pulling out a crumpled piece of paper. He smoothed it out on my coffee table, and I felt my jaw tighten at the sight. A spreadsheet. A list of neighbors, each with a corresponding fine amount. And then, next to each name, a column labeled status. Some were marked paid. Others? Pending lien. My eyes scanned the names. Mrs. Martinez, $200, paid. The Hendersons, $175, paid. The Clarks, $325, pending lien. I clenched my fists. She's threatening people with liens? Frank nodded. She tells them that if they don't pay, the HOA can take their homes. He swallowed hard. But it's a lie, Judge Carter. The HOA doesn't have that kind of authority, at least, not legally. I exhaled, my mind racing. Barbara had been scamming homeowners out of thousands of dollars, preying on those too afraid or uninformed to fight back. Frank wasn't done. He pulled out his phone, tapping a few times before handing it to me. And there's more. She's been watching people. The screen flickered to life, showing live security footage. Not just from her own house, but from all over the neighborhood. She had cameras hidden near driveways, front doors, even backyards. My stomach turned. She's spying on everyone. Frank nodded grimly. She keeps a file on every homeowner. Videos, notes, complaints. She watches people, waiting for them to slip up. Then she slaps them with a fine before they even realize they broke a rule, sometimes before they actually do. A slow, burning fury settled in my chest. This wasn't just about control anymore. This was something far worse. I looked Frank in the eye. You said she's been scaring people into paying. How much has she collected? He swallowed hard, then handed me one last sheet of paper. A bank statement. The HOA's official account. Or, rather, one of them. My eyes skimmed the figures, and my blood ran cold. Over $42,000 in compliance fees had been deposited into an account controlled solely by Barbara Wilson. It wasn't being used for neighborhood upkeep. It wasn't going to maintenance or repairs. She was pocketing it. I placed the paper on the table, staring down at it. Frank, I said slowly, you need to tell me everything. His hands trembled as he nodded. I'll tell you what I can, but... He hesitated. Barbara has people in City Hall. If she finds out what I'm doing, I don't know what she'll do to me. I met his eyes. Then we have to move fast. Before she realizes we're coming for her. The weight of Frank's confession settled like a stone in my chest. Barbara wasn't just an overzealous HOA president, she was running a full-fledged extortion racket, preying on homeowners who didn't know their rights. And now, I had the proof. I leaned back, exhaling slowly, my mind already working through the legal angles. This wasn't just HOA abuse. This was fraud, harassment, and possibly even embezzlement. And if Barbara had contacts inside City Hall covering for her, this could go far deeper than just our neighborhood. Frank rubbed his hands together anxiously. Judge Carter, if she finds out I gave you this, she'll destroy me. She's paranoid, she watches everyone. She even checks my emails. His voice dropped lower. She has someone in the county records office. If you request anything on the HOA, she'll know. I tapped a finger on the table, thinking. Then I won't request it myself. By the next morning, I had every shred of evidence Frank had given me copied and backed up. I didn't go through official HOA channels. Instead, I called in a favor from my court clerk, Sarah Whitmore. She didn't ask questions when I requested the original HOA bylaws and financial filings, ***, the ones actually on record with the county ***. 2 hours later, I had them in my hands. I spread the official documents across my desk, side by side with the ones Barbara had been distributing. And there it was, the smoking gun. Whole sections had been added, manipulated, and falsified. The real bylaws didn't mention basketball hoops, driveway extensions, or even solar panels. Barbara had fabricated every single restriction she'd been fining people for. My pulse pounded as I flipped through the financial records. The HOA's legitimate account, used for landscaping, maintenance, and community improvements, had just over $12,000 in it. But the other account? The one labeled, Compliance Revenue? $42,000. Not a penny of it had gone to the community. No expenses for repairs. No payments to vendors. Instead, I found withdrawals for airline tickets, luxury home renovations, and high-end boutique purchases. Barbara had been using the HOA as her personal piggy bank. That's when my phone buzzed. A blocked number. I hesitated, then answered. A distorted voice came through. "Judge Carter, you need to stop digging." I sat up straighter. "Who is this?" A pause. Then, "Barbara's not the only one with power in this town. Drop it, or you'll regret it." The call disconnected. I stared at my phone. This wasn't just about Barbara anymore. Someone else, someone bigger, was invested in keeping this buried. But I wasn't the kind of man to back down from a fight. That night, I called an emergency neighborhood meeting. The largest we'd ever had. Nearly every homeowner showed up, and from the moment I walked in, I could feel the electricity in the room, ***, a mix of fear, anger, and something else, something close to hope, ***. I didn't waste time. I connected my laptop to the projector and brought up the side-by-side comparisons of the HOA bylaws. "These," I said, pointing to the first document, "are the official, legally recognized HOA rules filed with the county." I let the word settle before clicking to the next slide. "And these? These are the rules Barbara has been enforcing." Gasps and murmurs filled the room. "She lied to us," Mrs. Martinez whispered, shaking her head. "She stole from us," Mr. Henderson muttered, gripping his cane. I pulled up the financial statements next. This account, labeled Compliance Revenue, was never disclosed to the community. Over $42,000 collected from fines and fees has gone directly into Barbara's personal account. A silence so thick it felt like the walls were closing in. Then, someone cursed under their breath. "She forced my husband and me to sell our second van because she fined us over and over," Mrs. Myers said, her voice trembling with anger. "We lost money. We lost business. And all this time, she was using our money to renovate her kitchen?" The floodgates burst. Neighbors shouted over each other, furious. Someone slammed a chair against the wall. People waved their own fines in the air, demanding answers. Barbara, seated at the front, had gone pale as a ghost. I leveled my gaze at her. "Barbara Wilson, do you have anything to say for yourself?" Her fingers clenched around the armrests of her chair. "This is a smear campaign," she hissed. "You're all ungrateful. Do you think the property values keep themselves up? Do you think this neighborhood runs on charity?" "Save it," I said coldly. "The sheriff's department will be very interested in these financial records." That's when Barbara snapped. She lunged toward the HOA laptop at the front table, frantically yanking out a USB drive. "You think you can take me down?" she screeched. "I built this neighborhood." But before she could make a run for it, Frank stepped in front of her. "You didn't build anything," he said, his voice steady for the first time in years. You just took. She whipped around, eyes wild, but she didn't get the chance to respond. Two uniformed officers stepped forward from the back of the room. Barbara Wilson, one of them said, pulling out a pair of handcuffs. You're under arrest for fraud, embezzlement, and financial misconduct. Barbara's mouth opened, but no words came out. As they led her toward the door, she turned back one last time, her face twisting in fury. You'll regret this, Carter, she spat. You have no idea who you're messing with. I held her gaze, unflinching. Neither did you. As the officers led Barbara Wilson out in handcuffs, the room remained eerily silent for just a moment, a collective intake of breath before the explosion. Then, it erupted. Neighbors shouted over one another, some in outrage, others in sheer disbelief. Mrs. Reynolds gripped the arms of her wheelchair, her voice shaking with emotion. She tried to make me remove my ramp, said it ruined the look of the neighborhood. And all this time, she was stealing from us. She threatened to put a lien on my house if I didn't pay a fine that wasn't even real. Mr. Henderson shouted. She forced my daughter to take down her birthday balloons, Mrs. Martinez added, her voice raw with anger. She made my son cry over a basketball hoop. A sharp whistle cut through the chaos. I turned to see Frank Wilson standing at the front of the room, looking more composed than I'd ever seen him. For a man who had spent years as Barbara's shadow, he finally looked like he had stepped into the light. We need to focus, Frank said, his voice steady. Barbara's gone, but the mess she made isn't. He was right. Even though she was in handcuffs, her influence hadn't completely vanished. There were still board members who had backed her, officials who had looked the other way, and tens of thousands of dollars unaccounted for. This wasn't over, not yet. I turned to the remaining HOA board members, my voice firm. You all need to resign. Tonight. Diane Whitman, one of Barbara's closest allies, crossed her arms. And what if we don't? Then the sheriff's office will be paying you a visit next, I said. We have evidence that Barbara didn't act alone. So unless you want to go down with her, I suggest you do the right thing. There was a long, tense silence. Then, one by one, the board members stood and placed their resignation letters on the table. Good, I said, looking around at the crowd. Now it's time to fix what's been broken. Frank stepped forward again, clearing his throat. First, we need to go through the finances. Every single fine paid under Barbara's rule needs to be refunded. That money belongs to this community. Murmurs of agreement rippled through the crowd. Mrs. Myers wiped a tear from her cheek. We sold our second van to pay those fines. If we could just get some of that money back. You will, I assured her. But there's something even bigger we need to do first. The entire room looked at me. We need to rewrite the rules. For years, the HOA had been a tool for control, a weapon used against the very people who lived here. That had to change. Over the next few hours, we worked together to review the real bylaws, strip away Barbara's fabricated amendments, and restore fairness to our neighborhood. Mrs. Reynolds, who had suffered more than most, was nominated as the new HOA president, a decision met with thunderous applause. She looked stunned, then determined. We need to do this right, she said firmly. No more arbitrary rules. No more fines for things that don't matter. And above all, no more fear. A new sense of unity filled the room. We weren't just fixing what Barbara had broken, we were building something better. But just as the meeting was winding down, my phone buzzed. A message from an unknown number. You think it's over? You've only scratched the surface. Check your mailbox. A cold shiver ran down my spine. Barbara had been taken down, but someone else was still watching. The days following Barbara Wilson's arrest felt like waking up from a long nightmare. For the first time in years, the neighborhood felt free. No more ridiculous fines for garden decorations, no more warnings about mailboxes or basketball hoops. The fear that had settled over Maple Lane like a storm cloud had finally lifted. One by one, changes swept through the community. Mrs. Reynolds, now officially the HOA president, made her first act a motion to refund every single bogus fine Barbara had issued. A few days later, checks started arriving in mailboxes, some for hundreds of dollars. The Patel family was able to repurchase their catering van. The Hendersons repaired their front steps with money they had been forced to hand over. Mrs. Myers called me, voice trembling, to tell me she could finally afford new school supplies for her kids. But the biggest change wasn't the money, it was the people. For years, neighbors had kept their heads down, afraid to speak up. But now, doors were open, voices were loud, and people weren't afraid anymore. The Rodriguez kids put their basketball hoop back up, and within hours, half the block was outside cheering them on. The Patel family hosted a cookout in their driveway, and no one worried about a fine for unauthorized gatherings. The HOA, once a tool for oppression, was now exactly what it was meant to be, a group of homeowners looking out for each other. Frank Wilson moved out of Barbara's house the week after her arrest. As the moving truck rumbled down the street, he stopped by my place, his expression lighter than I'd ever seen it. She had bank accounts in the Caymans, he told me, shaking his head. Over 200 grand stolen from other communities. She's been running this scam for years. Barbara's reign had ended, but the case against her was only just beginning. With the evidence we uncovered, she wouldn't just be losing her house, she'd be losing her freedom, too. That night, I stepped onto my front porch, watching families talk and laugh, no longer worried about who might be watching. It was strange how something as small as a driveway, a ramp, or a basketball hoop could hold so much weight, symbols of control that had now become symbols of victory. But as I reached for my mailbox, I hesitated. The message from the unknown number lingered in my mind. You think it's over? You've only scratched the surface. Inside, among the usual flyers and bills, was a single envelope with no return address. I opened it carefully, scanning the typed note inside. Barbara wasn't working alone. I exhaled slowly. The fight wasn't over. Not yet. Have you ever felt powerless against HOA, or Karen, rules? Share your experiences below, let's see who had it worse.